When Will Smith walked into an ordinary McDonald's, he only expected a quiet meal. But everything changed when two black girls became the target of blatant racism right before his eyes. What started with one unfair comment unraveled into a shocking revelation about the hidden layers of racism embedded in society. Will decides to step in, but can he challenge a system that has ignored people like them for years? McDonald's was bustling with activity. Customers stood in line placing orders, office workers quietly munched on burgers, and a group of teenagers laughed in the corner. At first glance, it was just another ordinary day, but everything changed when two young black girls walked into the restaurant. They looked hesitant, glancing around nervously, as if they didn't belong. Their clothes were neat but visibly worn. In their hands they clutched a few coins, gripping them tightly as though afraid someone might snatch them away. They quickly caught the attention of the manager, a middle-aged white man with a stern expression. He marched over to them immediately, his tone sharp and commanding. "You girls don't belong here. This place is for paying customers, not beggars." The older girl tried to respond, but her voice came out too softly. "We just wanted to buy some food." "Go buy it somewhere else." The manager interrupted. "Leave now or I'll have to call the police." This scene didn't go unnoticed by Will Smith, who was sitting in the corner booth. He didn't need to be a famous actor to understand what was happening. He had seen situations like this before. But this time, it struck a deeper chord. These were children. Standing up, Will walked calmly to the counter and addressed the manager. "Excuse me, why are you asking these girls to leave?" The manager turned to Will, frowning as he noticed who he was speaking to. His tone shifted slightly, though his words were just as dismissive. "They don't belong here. People like them only disrupt the experience for paying customers." "People like them?" Will repeated, his voice colder now. "They're trying to buy food. Do you have some kind of rule about who is allowed to eat here?" The manager faltered, but tried to maintain his stance. "Look, sir, I'm responsible for the reputation of this establishment." "Reputation?" Will leaned in closer. "What kind of reputation? A reputation for racism?" The restaurant fell silent as the conversation drew the attention of other customers. Will turned to the girls, bent down slightly, and said gently, "It's okay. Go sit at my table. I'll get you whatever you want." The girls hesitated at first, but then timidly moved to the table Will had pointed to. He placed an order, ignoring the manager's glares. While they waited for the food, the girls looked at him with gratitude and confusion. "Thank you, mister," the older girl said softly. But Will knew this incident was just the tip of the iceberg. He could feel it. Behind this seemingly simple moment lay a far greater problem, one he knew he couldn't ignore. The girls sat across from Will, gradually relaxing, but their eyes still betrayed a lingering wariness. They sipped juice from plastic cups, but hadn't yet touched the food, as if afraid someone might take it away. Watching them, Will decided to gently coax them into opening up. "Tell me about yourselves," he began softly. "You mentioned you're from a shelter?" The older girl nodded, squeezing her sister's hand tightly. "Yeah, there are a lot of us there, different kids. We live there until they find families for us." The younger girl added quietly, "If they find families." Will frowned, but he didn't interrupt. He could tell the word "used to" carried far more weight than they were letting on. "So why do you come here?" he asked, steering the conversation. The older girl sighed. "We wanted to buy something with the money we saved. Where we live, there's often not enough food. Sometimes they only give it to the older kids or the ones who are faster to the table. My sister and I try to save everything we can." "Ah," Her words made Will clench his fists under the table. He tried not to show his frustration. "But why do they make you leave places like this? You didn't do anything wrong." The girl gave a bitter smile. "People don't like us. We know that. If you're from a shelter and you're black, they always think you're up to no good." She paused briefly before continuing. Time. My sister and I were kicked out of a clothing store. We were just looking at the racks, but the sales lady said we couldn't afford anything and that she didn't want trouble." The younger girl, now feeling a little more open, chimed in. "Oh, time on the bus. They made us sit up front by the driver because someone complained we were too noisy, but we were just quietly talking to each other." Will listened to their stories, feeling a rising anger. It was hard for him to hear how much hatred and contempt these children had faced so early in their lives. "And what do you do in those situations?" he asked softly. The older girl shrugged. "We leave. If you argue, it gets worse. One time, a man in the park said we were stealing toys from white kids and called security, but we were just sitting on a bench." The younger girl lowered her gaze and whispered, "The policeman didn't even listen to us. He just told us to leave and not come back." Will froze at her words. He remembered being stopped and searched on the street as a teenager, despite having done nothing wrong. He remembered how he had just been treated to his mother, trying to justify the actions of those who treated him unfairly. The older girl spoke again, her voice steady but filled with resignation. We're used to it. People don't want to see us. They think we're trouble." The younger girl suddenly looked up at Will, her eyes full of tears. "Is it because we're bad?" Those words hit like a punch to the gut. Will stared at the girls, his heart breaking. He leaned in closer, choosing his words carefully. "No, it's not because of you. You're not bad. The bad ones are the people who treat you this way." The older girl wiped away her sister's tears and said quietly, "You're the only one who says that." That moment stuck with Will. He realized he couldn't just let this go. He had to do something, so children like these girls wouldn't feel invisible, so they could know that the world could be better. The stories became the catalyst for Will, marking the beginning of a journey that would change not only the girls' lives, but his own as well. The next morning, Will stood in front of the dilapidated building of the shelter. Its facade was as worn and tired as the stories the girls had told him. Peeling paint, cracks in the walls, and rusty swings on a small playground. Nearby, an old basketball hoop with a torn net swayed in the wind. Everything about this place spoke of neglect. There were no green lawns or fresh paint, only cracked asphalt and litter scattered along the edges of the yard. As Will studied the surroundings, the front door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. It was Miss Lawrence, the shelter's director. She looked exhausted, her faded suit hanging loosely on her frame, and her hair pinned back in a messy bun. She tried to appear cheerful, but there was tension in her smile. "Welcome, Mr. Smith," she said, extending her hand. "We're so glad you decided to visit us." "Thank you for having me, Ms. Lawrence," Will replied, shaking her hand. He glanced at the building and noticed children peeking cautiously out of the windows. "Do the girls I met yesterday live here?" "Yes," she sighed. "They've had a tough time, but many of our kids have similar stories. Please, come in and I'll show you around." They stepped inside, and Will was immediately struck by the musty smell of the old building, a mix of dust, dampness, and cheap cleaning products. The hallways were narrow, the walls peeling, and the floors covered with worn-out linoleum. The air was thick with a sense of scarcity. "We try to keep things clean," Ms. Lawrence began, almost apologetically. But our resources are so limited. Most of our donations go toward food and basic necessities. Will nodded, though his brow furrowed deeply. He turned, and the next mode of escape. How long has the shelter been in this state? Years, she admitted. We used to have more support, but over the past 5 years, our funding has been cut almost in half. She led him down a narrow hallway, past rooms where the children lived. In one room, bunk beds were crammed tightly together, each with thin mattresses and worn blankets. On the shelves were a few scattered toys that looked like they had been donated years ago. This is the girls' dormitory, Ms. Lawrence said. The ones you met yesterday? Stay here. Will surveyed the room. It was cramped and uncomfortable. How many children live in this room? 6, she replied. We don't have the space for fewer. Sometimes newcomers have to sleep on cots until a spot opens up. His gaze lingered on the walls, which were decorated with old wallpaper and faded children's drawings. These drawings seemed to be the only bright spot in the room. What about the other children? We have 38 kids in total, she continued. There are separate dorms for boys and one common room, but it's still not enough space. They moved on to the kitchen. It was equipped with old refrigerators, stoves with yellowed knobs, and shelves stocked with canned goods. On the table were packs of instant noodles and a few loaves of bread. We get help from local charities, Ms. Lawrence said, pointing to the food supplies, but often it's the bare minimum. I do my best to make sure there's enough for everyone, but sometimes we have to prioritize. What do you mean by prioritize? Will asked, his face darkening. She hesitated for a moment. Well, sometimes the younger children get more food because they're still growing. The older kids, they understand that there's not always enough to go around. These words made Will clench his fists. He remained silent to keep his frustration in check. In the common room, the children were playing with worn-out toys, an old building set, dolls with frayed hair. On the walls hung faded drawings, many of them depicting houses and families. Are these their dreams? Will asked, pointing to the drawings. Mrs. Lawrence let out a bitter laugh. Yes. Almost every child here dreams of having a family. Many of them have been waiting for years, but unfortunately, families rarely choose kids from our shelter. Will noticed a boy sitting in the corner with a book. He appeared to be about 8 years old, completely absorbed in his reading, as though blocking out the world around him. That's Jason, Miss Lawrence said, following Will's gaze. He's a very bright boy, loves to read. Will walked over to Jason and crouched down beside him. Hi, Jason. What are you reading? The boy looked up, startled at first, but then he answered shyly. It's about stars. I want to be an astronomer someday. An astronomer? That's impressive, Will said with a smile. You know, that takes a lot of studying. Jason nodded. I know, but at school, they say I'm a bad student. The teachers think I can't keep up. What would they think that? Will asked gently. Jason shrugged. 'Cause I'm from the shelter. They think we're all the same. Those words hit Will like a punch to the gut. He saw not a problem child, but a boy with dreams, held back by the prejudice of adults who should have nurtured him. When Will left the shelter, he stood by his car for a long time, trying to gather his thoughts. This visit had opened his eyes. He realized just how deeply rooted systemic racism and inequality were, and how much work it would take to change this reality. After visiting the shelter, Will couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen and heard. The stories the children told about injustice, poverty, and prejudice lingered in his mind. He needed to understand why society ignored these problems so blatantly. To get a clearer picture, He decided to immerse himself in the neighborhood surrounding the shelter, talk to local residents, teachers, and even the children themselves. What do you know, girl? Will began his day with a walk around the streets near the shelter. The neighborhood was a mix of contrasts. Single-story homes with peeling paint stood alongside well-kept suburban houses with pristine lawns and white picket fences. On one side of the street, faded graffiti marked the walls of abandoned buildings. On the other, tidy front yards showcased flowers and parked luxury cars. Siegfried. On the first corner, Will spotted a small grocery store. Its windows were plastered with discount posters, and a small crowd lingered outside. Figuring it would be a good place to start a conversation, Will stepped inside. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with a warm smile. Nearby, her assistant, a young man, was stocking shelves with bread. Will approached her and said, "Good morning. You have a nice little store here." The woman looked at him with curiosity, her eyes scanning his face. "Thank you. You're not from round here, are you?" "No. I was visiting the shelter nearby and wanted to get a sense of the neighborhood," Will replied. Her smile faded slightly. "Oh, the shelter. Yes, it's not far." "What do you think about it?" Will asked cautiously. The woman lowered her gaze, as if choosing her words carefully. "You know, people here have mixed feelings. Some say that the shelter brings, well, let's just call it unwanted energy to the area." "Unwanted?" Will repeated, already sensing where she was going. She sighed, setting a basket of goods on the counter. "People say that kids from the shelter steal. Teenagers from there can be noisy in the evenings. Not everyone here is happy about having it so close." Before Will could respond, a voice rang out from deeper in the store. It belonged to a man in a suit browsing the coffee aisle. Apparently, he had been listening to their conversation. "She's being polite," the man said loudly. "That shelter needs to be shut down. It's nothing but trouble." Will turned to face him, hauling him toward the center of the palace. Gavin waited right in the middle of center chaos. Will turned his head back to see if the vessel was still hidden and buried his face in the neck of the crystal garment. "What kind of trouble?" The man smirked with disdain. "Crime is up. The area's a mess. Those kids don't know how to behave. They only bring problems." Will fixed his gaze on the man. And if you Poco marries a dead help, I'm trapped in it back and forth. Ziamwa. I'm rotting away." "No, we're not going to go there. That's too much stress. I will not get contrite face anything the way this many times on anything I cannot control. I will not do that. The man shook his head dismissively. "No, and I don't intend to. Why should I? They are the way the streets made them." The man's words struck Will like a blow. This wasn't just an opinion. It was a reflection of deep-seated prejudice. The people in this neighborhood had already decided who these children were, without ever giving them a chance to prove otherwise. At the school. After the conversation at the store, Will headed to the local school where many of the shelter's children were enrolled. He knew education was key to breaking cycles of poverty, but he also suspected these children likely faced challenges even here. The school principal, Mr. Collins, met with Will in his office. He was a middle-aged man with a tired expression. "Mr. Smith, it's a pleasure to meet you. We don't often get visitors, especially someone as well known as you." "Thank you for your time," Will replied. "I wanted to ask about the kids from the shelter. How are they doing here?" Mr. Collins frowned slightly. "To be honest, it's challenging. Many of them come in with significant educational gaps, but the biggest issue is their social status." "What do you mean?" Will asked. The shelter kids face a lot of bias, Collins admitted. And unfortunately, that bias comes not just from their peers, but from some of the teachers as well. Teachers? Will said, surprised. Came the pleasant and friendly voice of an old man. Yes, Collins sighed. Some of my colleagues think those kids are troublemakers by default. They rarely get encouragement and are more likely to be punished. If something happens in a classroom, the shelter kids are the first to be blamed. The principal suggested Will speak with Miss Harrison, one of the teachers who had worked at the school for years. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, but a tired expression. I try to help all my students, she said, but these kids come here carrying so much baggage. They're belittled, spoken down to, and surrounded by negativity. It shapes how they see themselves. She paused for a moment before continuing, and then she paused for a moment before saying, "That was incredible." Recently, I assigned an essay topic, my dream. Most of the shelter kids wrote about wanting a home and a family. Others wrote that their dream was just to be treated like normal people. Her words struck Will deeply. These children weren't dreaming of adventures or lofty goals. They were dreaming of the basic human needs that so many take for granted. Meeting the teens. As Will left the school, he noticed two teenagers standing on the corner wearing matching shirts with the shelter's logo. They looked hesitant, as if unsure of where to go. "Hey, guys!" Will called out to them. One of them, a boy with short curls, looked up and studied him carefully. "You're the guy who was at the shelter today, right?" "Yeah, that was me," Will replied. The boy hesitated for a moment before adding, "Thanks for coming. People usually don't care about us." His words hit Will like a punch to the gut. He realized just how much his visit meant to these kids, far more than he had initially understood. That day opened Will's eyes to the full depth of the problem. He realized the children from the shelter were not just battling a lack of resources. They were also fighting the stigma that followed them everywhere. This wasn't an isolated case. It was a systemic issue that demanded change, and Will was ready to be part of that change. The day after his conversations with the locals and his visit to the school, Will decided to return to the shelter. This time, he didn't just want to see the place, but to spend time with the children and staff to understand what life was like on the inside. His previous visit had left him with many questions, and he knew this was just the beginning. Morning at the shelter. The boys. When Will arrived at the shelter's entrance, Miss Lawrence greeted him once again. She looked just as tired as before, but there was a hint of warmth in her expression this time. She seemed more at ease, perhaps because she was starting to trust his intentions. "Mr. Smith, it's wonderful to see you again. The kids have been talking about you nonstop since yesterday," she said with a small smile. "I'm glad to be back. Today, I'd like to spend more time with the kids and get a better sense of how they live," Will replied. "Of course," she said, her tone genuine, but her eyes betraying exhaustion. "I'll show you everything I can." Breakfast. The first stop was the dining hall. It was a small room with long wooden tables and mismatched chairs, many of which creaked with every movement. The children were gathering for breakfast, each carrying a tray with modest portions of oatmeal, slices of bread, and cups of milk. "We're lucky today," Miss Lawrence whispered as she noticed Will's gaze. "A local baker donated some fresh bread. Usually, we have to rely on frozen loaves."
Will watched as the children sat in small groups, chatting quietly among themselves. In one corner, two teenagers sat apart from the others, their expressions withdrawn. Will decided to join them.
"Hey, mind if I sit here?" he asked. They nodded, visibly surprised by his presence. One of the boys, thin with a sharp gaze, was the first to speak. "You're the actor, right? The one from Men in Black?" Will smiled. "Yeah, that's me, but right now, I'm here to learn about you. How are things for you here?" The boy shrugged. "It's okay, better than being on the streets." Again. His friend, sitting beside him, added quietly, But it's still hard. Sometimes it feels like you're stuck here forever." "Do you feel that way?" Will asked, feeling a pang of sadness. The boy looked down at his tray. "No one wants to take us in. People think there's something wrong with us just because we're here." The playroom. After breakfast, Miss Lawrence led Will to the playroom, where the children spent much of their free time. The room was furnished with old chairs and tables, and the toys were clearly worn out from years of use. In the center of the room, a group of younger kids played a board game, though many of the pieces were missing. In a corner, a little girl sat with a notebook, drawing with colored pencils that were nearly used up. Will approached her. "Hi there. What are you drawing?" She looked up at him shyly and smiled. "And who lives in the house?" The girl paused for a moment, then answered, "Me and my mom." Will realized this drawing was more than just an activity. It was her dream, something she longed for deeply. He crouched beside her. "You're really good at this. Where did you learn to draw?" "Here," she said. "Sometimes volunteers come and teach us." "Well, you're doing a great job," Will said. "Never stop dreaming." Talking to the staff. Throughout the day, Will had the chance to speak with several staff members. One of them, Mr. Carlton, had been working at the shelter for over a decade. He was a man in his 40s with a tired but kind face. "To be honest, this is tough work," Mr. Carlton admitted, as they spoke in a small office. "Everything here is stretched to its limit. The funding is minimal, and the kids' needs are enormous." "How do you manage?" Will asked. "Sometimes it feels like we don't," Mr. Carlton said with a sigh. "We're short on teachers, counselors, everything. And these kids, they've been through so much pain. A lot of them don't even believe happiness is possible." He paused for a moment, then added, "But I can't leave this place. When you see a kid smile for the first time after weeks of silence, it's worth it." Evenings with the teenagers. By evening, Will decided to spend some time with the teenagers. They were gathered in a small room equipped with an old video game console and a few books. "How's it going here?" Will asked the group. One of the boys, tall and lanky, smirked. "Depends on the day. Sometimes it's fine. Sometimes, not so much." "What's the hottest pot?" A girl sitting on the floor looked up. "People think we're bad. If someone finds out you're from the shelter, they start avoiding you." "She's right," another teen chimed in. "Even at school, we're always the first ones to get blamed if something happens." Will felt his determination grow stronger. These kids didn't deserve this. They weren't the problem. They were the result of a problem created by society. This day solidified Will's resolve. The stories these children shared were more than heartbreaking. They were a call to action. Will knew he couldn't stand idly by. These kids deserved a better future, and he was determined to help them find it. This story highlights how deeply rooted prejudices and systemic injustice can deprive the most vulnerable, children, of their chance for a dignified life. Children in shelters don't choose where they are born or how they end up in difficult circumstances, yet society often turns its back on them or judges them unfairly instead of helping. Through his journey, Will Smith saw that the problem isn't just about the lack of resources or support. The true tragedy lies in how society views these children as others, as different, deserving only pity or disdain. The attitudes of neighbors, teachers, and even some shelter staff show that change is needed not only in material support, but in how we perceive and treat them. This story serves as a reminder that compassion and attention can change lives. One person can inspire transformation, but systemic change requires the effort of everyone. If people begin to see these children not as problems, but as individuals with potential, society can give them a future where they are not outcasts, but valued members of their communities. The takeaway is simple. Injustice should never be accepted as normal. We must fight prejudice and create conditions where every child, regardless of their background, feels worthy, loved, and capable of dreaming big. End of section 13.